Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me. I've got a great stream this evening. Obviously, lots of talk about the Biden administration's plan when it comes to student loan forgiveness. And I thought if there's one guy who has been incredibly consistent with, I think, the right attitude on this, it's Will Chamberlain. So I figured I'd have him on, have him talk to you guys a little bit. Will, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Auron.
Absolutely. Could you do me a favor for people who might not be familiar? Could you just give a little introduction?
Sure, yeah. Will Chamberlain. I'm formerly publisher of Human Events. I'm no longer involved there, but I am senior counsel at the Internet Accountability Project, which focuses on stopping big tech abuses, and the Article 3 Project, which fought to confirm Trump's judges and also fights against legal abuses by the left.
Excellent. And if you're unfamiliar with Will, of course, I've got his links below in case you need to find him in the description there. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. I think the first thing that a lot of people are asking is, can the Biden administration actually do this, right? Because you had Nancy Pelosi come out and say, no, you've got to pass legislation through Congress. She said that a while back, like when they were originally floating this idea, there's no way that the president can do this. So, what is their plan? How would they actually make this happen legally?
So I haven't done tons of reading on the legal rationale, but I have like a basic surface understanding, and it
Hmm.
seems like they're using some of the emergency authorities that the president has whenever a national emergency is declared to forgive this debt. Now, the specific national emergency they're using relates to COVID, and so they're saying because of the COVID national emergency, there's another statute that says if you have a national emergency ongoing, you can forgive some debt. Whether this will actually hold up in court, I'd bet that it probably would, but I think it's a close question, given the tenuousness of the link between the national emergency and the authority being asserted. So I think there's some chance that it might be rejected, but I think it's actually a much closer question than say, there was a whole thing where the Biden suspended rent for 2 months or based on the HHS like maybe a year ago. That was much more clearly unlawful and clearly ultra vires. This is a much closer question. I'm not actually sure like how a court will end up coming down. And I think that the Biden administration is on more firm ground with this than they were with some of the things they've done previously.
What do you think about, in general, kind of the attempts? Obviously, the left are the ones who are kind of better at pushing this, but we've seen both sides with this, with kind of the permanent state of exception, like always having the ability to extend these emergency orders, always being able to generate new powers through this. Is there any hope of the legal system reining, kind of pulling this in? Is this a feature only of kind of the Democrats having more institutional control of different organizations, or are we going to see this going forward from kind of both sides, do you think?
I think the Democrats historically have been more willing to simply find and be aggressive in their use of existing authority, in being a little more creative than Republicans have been willing to be. So, national emergency authority is one of those areas where you say, well, this is unprecedented. It's like, well, kind of, but if you remember at all the debate about Trump trying to declare a national emergency and fund the border wall using funds from moving around funds within the Department of Defense. One of the big things you learned there was that actually we have something like 100 national emergencies declared right now
Yeah.
all over the world because it is the primary way that the executive branch implements sanctions. That's normally that would have to go through Congress, but since Congress created this authority to implement sanctions via national emergency, basically the way our government has decided to function is, well, we're just going to declare a national emergency anytime we want to impose sanctions on anybody without having it go through Congress. And both parties have used this, and it's just been, it's been an ongoing thing. So, that essentially, the we've broken the seal on national emergency, exploiting national emergency law to, enable an executive branch action for quite some time now. And so now the question is just, who's going to do what with the available authorities? And really the only thing constraining it, I think, is just general public opinion. I mean, there are some incredible authorities that the president could do, seizing radio stations, for instance, by declaring a national emergency. And I think the only thing really stopping that is just public backlash.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, one of the things you learn is that there's just constantly, like, all the way from local governments up to the top, we're just constantly in states of emergency. They're declaring them all the time for any number of reasons, like you said, to kind of unlock those different powers and have those options. So I think you're probably right about that. So to get to the actual meat of what we're going to be talking about, a lot of conservatives had a lot of reactions to this. I think the right's messaging on this has kind of been just unmitigated disaster from a lot of people. There are some people I think with better tacts like yourself, but one of the very common approaches that we see is the way that many on the right are approaching this, especially kind of the more mainstream right, is these people, these young people, they're just really irresponsible. They signed for these loans. They've committed to this. We can't possibly now forgive those debts. What do you think about that line of reasoning? Do you think that's a winning argument for the right when it comes to student loan forgiveness? And is there a better way to approach this?
I mean, I think it's a terrible argument. I mean, and just abstractly think if any other industry was issuing, six-figure loans to teenagers, and then the product that they were purchasing with those loans only had like a 50% success rate, the FTC would shut them down, and everybody would be fine with that. I don't even think conservatives would be fine with that. It would be like, that's fraudulent. It's not okay. We're going to make the perpetrators of the fraud compensate the victims to the extent that that's possible, and maybe there will be criminal charges. And I think that the reason I actually, try and use the phrase "seize the endowment" so often is not necessarily because I think that would be legal or not, but rather because I think that using the language of seizing, you seize assets that were procured via fraud, right? That's what government does. You don't tax those assets because you tax assets that were sort of rightfully accrued. So no. The way I view it is colleges have been defrauding students, and the students are victims. Now, does that mean that working class Americans should randomly be forced to pay and compensate the victims of this fraud? I don't think that's right at all. Not when the universities themselves have so many assets that can be plundered. And moreover, I think it's the most important thing, and I think the Republicans haven't really focused on this at all, is if Democrats are essentially saying that everybody who has college debt, they're going to get it forgiven. Well, that means all college debt is fraudulent, and all of it should be seen, and that means all the universities need to should be forced to shift the way they operate.
Yeah, like I said, I really appreciate your approach and that you've been really consistent on this, because I do think you said like that's a failure to understand kind of the enormity of the problem. Because a lot of people on the right just want to say things like, "Well, don't send your kids to college. Just don't send your kids to college. Find them, let them do something else." And okay, I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that argument, but I think the idea that you're just not going your just base response is don't send your kids to the thing that currently in our society determines kind of your social class and your ability to make a living. Just don't send them there, and then you'll be fine, right? Like, I think that's kind of a disastrous approach. Not because in the end it might be more valuable to find trade or another way, another path through life, but because it's just signaling that Republicans don't understand the enormity of the problem, that they've in many ways accepted kind of the permanency of college and how it's going to continually be like the structure by which we kind of facilitate hiring and everything else. And they've just kind of onboarded that, and they say we're just going to remove ourselves entirely basically from kind of the upper class or the educated class. We're going to extricate ourselves from that so that we're not sending our kids to this, rather than understanding that what you really need to do is address the fact that this organization that is defrauding kids, providing them with something that is useless and is brainwashing them, is at the kind of the center of the socioeconomic ladder of your society.
Correct. And it's like the actual education is worthless. The only thing that is of value that is being provided is the credential. But that system is terrible for students, right? It's terrible for one reason, because a lot of them still don't have any really meaningful skills that they developed out of that. So even if they can like join the workforce, they aren't able to hold on to a job because they haven't learned anything of real value. And then the second problem is it's indoctrination that's adverse to the interests of conservatives more generally. And so, I seizing the endowments is just like, I want conservatives generally to be creative. Like, we have this really powerful institution that is implacably hostile to us, that is defrauding students, that is extraordinarily expensive, is a sinecure for all our adversaries. Okay, so we should do something about this. And so one creative idea, I think I'm the only person talking about this, is there's a lot of questions you're not allowed to ask as an employer when you are hiring employees, right? You're not allowed to make them take an IQ test, for example. What if you just weren't allowed to ask them whether they had their bachelor's or not? Like, that's no employee. If you're an employer, you're just not allowed to ask that question. It's illegal. It's, people aren't allowed to put it on their resumes. If you do and you ask an employee that question, they could sue you in court. and say, like, you're discriminating wrongfully against me for not having a college degree. I think it would just dramatically change the dynamic, because it's not that, okay, maybe you would change the law so that people could have aptitude tests or some sort of knowledge area tests, but they weren't allowed to ask about a bachelor's. And that would just dramatically change the cost benefit analysis for people who are going to college in the first place. And it would solve the problem whereby, in order to join like the upper class or get this kind of upward mobility, you have to go through this super leftist indoctrination, which is, I think, it's a big structural problem for the right, not just in long term. It really is. Something else I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, David Shore, who's like the leftist poll wizard. He's the guy who's like super leftist, but wants them to stop talking about immigration because he thinks it loses them elections. He's pointed out that like the primary dividing line in modern America is education, in terms of what filters people through the Democratic or Republican Party, not wealth, not intelligence, education. And so we should be we want less people going to college. We still want people to be, powerful and, join, be upwardly mobile, but we don't want them to have to go to college to do that. And I think that like figuring out a way to attack the existing college institutions and then replace that credentialing system with something else, something that's a lot more friendly to our voters, a lot less friendly to the left, is something it's like a big long-term project for us.
But Will, if you do that, you're limiting the rights of the employers, right? Like, free market, they've got to be able to ask us questions. The right, they have
Oh
to
no.
support the freedom of the market to do this, right? Like, how do you shift the understanding of so many in kind of that talk radio right wing sphere, where like the corporations are just private businesses and they should have infinite rights on how they treat people and how they approach hiring?
I mean,
How do you approach that?
we settled all these questions with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which, I mean, I've had this debate, in the big tech context or whatever. I mean, do you want to repeal that? Do you want to, like, are we going to go back to saying that motels and restaurants in the Jim Crow South were perfectly fine discriminating against Black people? Like, I think that's wrong. I don't think they should have been able to do that. And I think, so one, on a moral level, I don't think it's right. But two, on a pragmatic level, like, you can either choose to try and attack the entire superstructure of law built around non-discrimination and built around constraining the ability of employers to act in order to seek your libertarian utopia. You're not going to succeed, right? No chance. You're Don Quixote. Or you can take that as the like underlying foundation of American law, which it basically is at this point, and say, okay, well, what can we build on top of that will achieve conservative ends? And there's actually quite a lot of things, because they're discriminating against conservatives pretty rampantly. And so I think, if you're actually looking for like what is the elegant solution here to conservatives being able to like not be screwed over by these institutions, well, gee, I don't know, maybe it would be saying, guess what, you can't discriminate against people who don't have college degrees anymore. And then you get to import all the existing civil rights law over and have it apply in a way that is very, very unfriendly to the left.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion that kind of the civil rights law is far more of a disaster. I don't know that you can, I think Caldwell makes a pretty good argument in his book that like this
Yeah, I
is
need to
just a
read that.
second. Yeah, it's a really great book, and this is just the second Constitution, and whether if you have access to the Constitution, you're a real citizen. If you don't have access to this Constitution, then you have to play by the old rules. And so I think that it would be great if you could use the civil rights law to do what you're doing, right? Just kind of
Mhm.
bend it to your own purposes and use it to help you. I don't know that the machine is ever going to let you do that. I don't think that you get to justify it that way, but it's at least it's creative. At least it's thinking outside of the box and I think in the right direction. Okay, if this is going to be a fundamental part of our legal framework, then why aren't we using it to help our friends and punish our enemies, right?
Right. Yeah. And I see a lot of people saying, well, we should repeal it. And it's like, okay, imagine a world where you could do that. Like the odds of you ever I mean, I think the odds of actually getting to that world are incredibly low. Now, if you could, I don't know, and, replace it with something different, we could do some sort of repeal and replace, to make sure that we capture some of the things we think are really important. But honestly, the funny thing is, even if now, imagine a world where, I think Adrian Vermeule talks about this, how law, shapes culture and law teaches
Mhm.
effectively. In a world where you actually repealed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, would private entities behave any differently than they currently do in terms of how they discriminate? Right? Would they start discriminating on the basis of race again? Or like, I mean,
They
I guess
already do.
honestly, if you repealed Civil Rights Act, like I'd probably feel a lot more free to start discriminating on the basis of race, just not the way that righties think they would prefer.
I
Um,
think they already do discriminate on the basis of race, and they don't
right.
care. Like I think
Yeah.
I mean, you have multinational companies who openly say things like, "Yeah, we're only looking for people of color for this position." I don't think civil rights law can protect people inside the right wing
Interesting.
coalition, right?
I don't know. I mean, I think you could, this is where I'm a little more white pilled than a lot of people. Like, I think this is where I actually have a more interesting and nuanced debate with some libertarians like Michael
Hmm.
Malice and Dave Smith, people like that. When they go after my civil rights for platform access as a civil right argument, and they say, well, you just can't rely on the courts. I'm like, well, this is why we stack the courts with conservatives. And one of the benefits that can come from that is that if you stack the court with conservatives and then who are textualists oriented too, and then you rewrite the law to like accommodate you and make it very explicit. I don't know. I'm not as black pilled as some people are. And I think if I think and, in the sense, I think that there's an opportunity, right, to wield civil rights law against the people who are already discriminating on the basis of race. I'm not sure we're doing a very effective job of that as a legal project, seeking litigation, really trying to make new law. Um, but second, I still think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm definitely a little more white pilled on this.
Well, like you said, it's about what you can do, right?
Mhm.
There are realities on the ground. So if you can gain ground there until you can make bigger changes, then maybe that's an avenue to pursue. I think in the long run, I think you are going to have more hindrance from civil rights law than anything else than
Mhm.
victories. But if you can make if you can make a victory there out of it, then it's perhaps valuable in that way.
Sure.
Yeah. So, if conservatives need to approach this in this different light, right? They need to
Mhm.
see this as a way to. You're not going to convince anyone, I think, that paying off college debt is bad, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't. Did you see the tweet from one Republican? I think he's just like a state rep somewhere, but he was like, if you pay off student debt, then the armed services won't have a recruitment tool while we have low enrollment. Yeah, it was insane. It's absolutely
What?
insane. Yeah.
Like, oh no, right?
Right.
Like, oh no, the armed services won't be able to recruit people for like more trans ideology
Yes.
seminars. Like, like there's so many different problems with that, right? Like,
Yeah.
at each level, uh, you know, like we need people to go to college to get indoctrinated so they can come to the military and get indoctrinated some more.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge problem for conservatives too, right? Is they fundamentally don't understand their position right now.
Yes.
Like they're still here defending institutions because they're conservative and that's their job, right? And,
Mhm.
and so they still don't understand the nature of the conflict, that it's the ground has shifted underneath them, that the institutions are now all captured by their enemies, and
Mhm.
continuing the defense of that order and those institutions is to defend kind of the power of your enemies now.
Right, right. Like I think I guess actually this is a really I just thought of this. I view the world through the prism of in 2020, which is like all the institutions are against us except the courts. Right, that's like the one institution we actually have. We're not like totally implacably against us. Like judges still interpret law. We have a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court, which is constraining the appellate courts. Like that's the one area I'm white pill, but almost all the other institutions in American society I'm black pilled on. And yes, because they are so hostile to us, we're not trying to conserve them anymore. Like what we're going for is a sort of restoration, or some sort of new creative imagined future where we can create like the fairness or the world that is not so incredibly alien to us. And that requires like creativity, it requires pragmatism, it requires not being stuck in thought patterns of the past, right? Like this, oh, we shouldn't do, this complete refusal to do anything on policy, this like, oh, we need to preserve existing institutions like the military, the universities are okay. And no, like they're all irredeemable. So how do we how do we dismantle this and then create something new that will be better?
Yeah, I don't understand how people watch the FBI go after like parents at school board meetings and think that, oh yeah, no, it's we just get the next guy in and he tweaks like one guy running these institutions and it's
Yeah.
all fine
No, no,
again. Like,
no. There are, one of the things I think about with the FBI is, I've been actually trying to read about their authorities and try and get a sense of it. There's not like a lot of statutory authority for the FBI. Most of it is direct grant from the Attorney General, and so
mm,
that creates the possibility to just sort of if you're, a President DeSantis or Trump walks in again on day one, what could they do with an executive order to like defang the FBI? Well, you could strip it of its counterintelligence authority like tomorrow if you wanted to. There are reasons you wouldn't do that. Like there are sort of underhanded things they could do. And, there are potential, like some of that authority needs to be reallocated to other agencies. Otherwise you have major ball drops on security. But, we should look at the FBI and say, okay, not, the default is no, we preserve this. No, the default is your jobs are all gone and then you need to reapply for them. Right. Like maybe we need to create, I think the really fun tack would be to create a new agency to kind of subsume some of the authorities we think are important to the FBI. Like they probably should have the crime lab. They probably should be tracking serial killers. That's all well and good. But they don't need to do it under the auspices of the FBI anymore. We create a new institution, the FJB, the Federal Justice Bureau, to handle all these new authorities.
Yeah, just break it apart and pick up the things that are essential and then move forward.
Right.
So one thing that I think a lot of the problems that conservatives face when they kind of have this vision is that we saw, especially with obviously the Trump presidency, even if someone does come in and has maybe ideas that are outside the box and they're willing to implement them and they're willing to use executive power, one thing that they're really facing is an uphill battle is they don't have the expertise around them necessary to get that done. And a big problem with that is like everyone who goes to the institutions that give you the credentials and the expertise to operate kind of the gears of Washington and make this stuff happen also hates you and doesn't want you to alter that system because that's the very thing that vested them with their power. And now we see these federal agencies going after different pieces of the Trump administration in blatant intimidation, right? FBI literally raids the president. So how does the right marshal its forces and create kind of a bullpen of talent to make these things happen and help an executive who is willing to exercise this power if basically even just serving in a presidential administration could end up putting you, in jail?
Yeah, this is where we actually do need people to like get the credentials necessary to like actually serve in these positions in the short term, right? I'm not happy about this solution, but I don't know if you're familiar with American Moment and Saurabh Sharma.
Mhm.
Like their project is important, right? They're trying to credential Trumpy people and like get them in, Hill internship positions and then potentially put them in the Hill. Like we do need more organizations like that and more funding for them to like identify good people and bring them in. And then also we just need to, we need to kind of create a friendly, somehow we need to get some like legal W's here. It's like it also, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where we need to actually change some laws in order and get some power to do this. But in order to wield that power, we have to have the right people in place. So hopefully we can kind of resolve that. But I think, I just hope like, let's win first. Let's win. Let's take power. When we get the Republican Party in power, there, as much as I, can be frustrated with the Republican Party, it's our vehicle. Democrats are never going to be our vehicle. The Republican Party is still our vehicle, and actually gets, I could see either a President Trump or a President DeSantis White House being very effective. I honestly think a DeSantis White House would be more effective, but I could see either White House being very effective on this subject.
So when you talk about seizing of endowments, of course, there's a lot of people on the right who kind of clutch their pearls with that kind of rhetoric, right? And we see this in general across the board. Of course, there are many people, the David Frenches of the world that are just, constantly aghast that anyone would kind of talk about taking these kind of measures. But can you explain the purpose of kind of setting that anchoring point? Kind of getting that stuff out there, because I think a lot of people are like, "Well, this is all overblown, and you can't do any of this. And why would you talk like that if you can't actually make this stuff happen?" What is the purpose of that kind of rhetoric, and how does that make the right kind of think outside the box and be more likely to take risks and do things that might actually make changes?
Right. So it's an important frame for a couple obvious reasons. First off, you hinted at it, but the idea of setting an anchor, an aggressive anchor for where the policy should be, and or to sort of make it so that the compromise position is merely taxing them aggressively. That's just basic psychology, right? You want to be more aggressive with what you push for, so you get something middling. And I think a really good example of how that works is the left wanted to cancel all student debt, and just they got Biden to cancel 10,000 of it. That's a pretty big W for their base and their constituency. So we should be thinking along those lines. Like when we actually want a policy, we should be advocating something substantially more aggressive if possible. And then the second good thing about that framing is that it uses the language of fraud, which I think I might have mentioned before, but I think it's really important to use the language of fraud when you talk about universities. We don't tax assets. We seize assets that are unlawfully or wrongfully acquired. That's what the government does. So, saying seize the endowments dishonors the university system. It says that all these things, all these donations, all these things, we think they're wrongful. We think they should simply be seized by the government and taken. And that's our starting point. We think your institutions are fraudulent. We want you to go away. And I think that would help frame, if Republicans really embrace it. I'm seeing more and more of it. It's really, really feels reassuring to see people like Tucker joking about seizing the endowments. I think that should just be a constant joke on our side, because it frames the debate, and it focuses, again, people, instead of focusing just complaining about unfairness, it says, no, the universities are the enemy, and we should be framing policy to hurt them.
Now, what do you think about the aspect of patronage? Because another thing that I've seen a lot of people go at, and at least this is slightly better. They're at least recognizing that the college system is a patronage system for the left, and that it is a way to pass along money and positions and power to people who vote for the left, and kind of ensure that they're going to be the ones in charge of institutions. So at least they're recognizing the systemic advantage that's kind of baked into the college system there. But their response seems to be, well, then we just need to get rid of patronage. Like, that the problem is the patronage. And if everyone just went back to being like equal, and the government didn't do this, and the left wasn't able to do this, then we'd be fine. But I think that's a problem, because I think it just ignores a reality about politics, and that it is about rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And as long as the right has this mindset that it's always going to be just returning to this base neutral setting, then it's always going to be a scenario where it's losing to the left, because the left is always making sure its people get something out of its presidency and its victories, and the right is at best battling back to just zero. And so the left is always advancing, and the right is always simply slowing it down when it's in power.
Right. It's a one-way ratchet.
Right.
Effectively with aid. They get benefits when they're in power. Republican voters get nada. That can't be right. And I think, even some other creative ideas. What if you said, as a response to this silliness, that married families with children will get $10,000 only if they didn't get a $10,000 debt forgiveness. Like, that's the new Republican policy, essentially saying, no, guess what? We are going to reward people. We are going to reward Republican voters. We are going to incentivize people to behave in ways which will make them Republican voters, right? Like, I think the stats on, if you actually get married and have kids, you're much more likely to vote Republican. And I don't think that's just, that's not. I don't think that's merely a correlation. Correlation. I think there's some causation going on there. That your concerns when you become a parent and your concerns when you're married are dramatically different from single people. So I think that's one angle that we should take. Like, that's kind of the kind of stuff Hungary does, right? They're trying to incent it, not just, in a way you could see that what Democrats are doing here is they're incentivizing people to behave in ways which will lead more of them to be more democratic, right? And maybe we should be incentivizing people to behave in ways which themselves will make them more likely to be right wing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that understanding that you're creating loyalty, you're creating wins for your base that's going to energize them, but you're also creating a future in which people are living the kind of lifestyles, and they're inhabiting the kind of patterns of life that will make them into more of the kind of citizens who will be the kind of people you want to live with and share values with, and B, will support you in the future. There's a reason that they go nuts every time Tucker explains that, like, the demographic transformation of the country ensures left-wing victories, and that they say that out loud on a regular basis, because he's just giving away the game, right? That like, they are ensuring a future in which the pattern of growth of the country will kind of lock them in power and perpetuity. And the right has nothing like that. They have no plan going forward that has a similar effect on the country. So if the left has a monopoly on all the things that will generate a more leftward trend for the voters, then you're always fighting with, both arms tied behind your back. You're fated to lose because you have no eye towards the future, setting up a pattern that's going to recreate conservative values, right-wing values, the kinds that are going to ensure you have a better society, and you also have people who are going to support you politically.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that, I mean, and essentially, I think they've broken the seal with this sort of thing. If we're just handing out money to people, I mean, this is way more dramatic than even the COVID handouts, if you think about it, because COVID was what, 2,000 for everybody or something like that. This is 10,000 for just our people, and all of them, including the people making 110 a year with a master's. Okay, right now that's the game now. Okay, that's fine. We can play that game too. Rather than, I don't want to hear complaining about unfairness and then not doing anything about it. I want to hear, what are we going to do now that this is the standard and we know they're going to do it in the future? We need to have our program of how we're going to use government money and make them be the ones complaining about how unfair it is that married families with children are getting a $10,000 bonus.
Yeah, that's something that drives me absolutely insane when I see like the GOP accounts like posting like, "Can you believe what Biden said?" or "Can you believe what these things are doing?" They're just kind of posting reaction stuff. It's like, guys, I do that stuff on Twitter because I'm a random dude. You're like the opposition party in theory. So
Yeah.
like, why aren't you telling me about the positive vision that's going to counteract this? Why don't you tell me about the action you're taking? Why do you have the same response as random people online when it comes to
Yeah.
this stuff? Why
It's your
aren't we putting
job to
together
be
plans?
creative, right? You
Yes.
you have power. You are vested with power from us. Like, what's your plan? And if and like it definitely needs to be more of that. And that's true, that's true with education policy. What are you going to do about the universities? Stop complaining that they're unfair. What are you going to do about big tech? Stop complaining that they're censoring you or relying on private companies to somehow solve a monopoly censorship problem.
So how much of this do you think is people in the establishment right simply not understanding what's necessary, and how much of it is really the nature of controlled opposition? Because I thought I thought a lot of it was controlled opposition before I started to talking to people that were a little higher up the food chain. And the more I talk to them, the more I'm shocked that like people in relatively like important roles are just kind of unfamiliar with like what is necessary and what's going on. And that's kind of surprising to me. Like I still think there's a big control opposition aspect to this. Like I think Mitch McConnell is perfectly aware of what his role is, but I am surprised at the number of people that just legitimately don't seem to understand. They've just taken kind of these really base level conservative talking points and make them like the central part of high level discussions, and they don't understand the need to like fundamentally change the way they're approaching the game.
Well, I mean, think about all the Republican donors who donate to their alma maters, right? Let's start there. I think that's a
Yeah.
really good example of this sort of like obliviousness. I wouldn't say it's those people are controlled, right? They're just they have good memories of their college days. They've been supporting their college football teams. Like and they aren't thinking, wait, when we talk about the university's bad, we're talking about my alma mater being a bad place that kids shouldn't go to and that I shouldn't support with my money. That's a dramatic difference for a lot of people. And so, I think about Lamar Alexander, retired from the Senate, but his last big bill was a big college education bill. And they've been, our donors have been conditioned to think, donate to your colleges, we'll put your name on it. It's great philanthropy. This is how you build your record. And all these super leftists take their money, put their name on a building, and then take that money and like build a program that is completely adverse to what they would have wanted, indoctrinates people exactly the way they wouldn't have wanted. So, I'm not as pessimistic about, essentially, I think that it's much easier. Don't attribute to malice what can be more easily attributed to stupidity and ignorance, right? This seems like a much bigger problem is they don't know what time it is. They don't know what the score is. And so that's why we haven't seen this level of creativity.
Yeah, I think Hanlon's razor has taken a lot of L's recently. I think you can attribute to both, but I
Right,
hear you.
with the
Yeah.
FBI certainly, like, right,
Yeah,
and
right.
that's true that it's weaker now than I would say before, but even
Yeah,
so.
no, I understand that heuristic. Yeah, so one thing that you touched on that I wanted to delve a little deeper into is, of course, another thing you're going to hear a lot from conservatives because they're locked into the idea of fiscal conservatism is
Mhm.
we're already, inflation's already happening. where it's already spiraling out of control. We're already spending the money on the college. We can't spend money to reward our people, because then the entire financial system falls apart. Like I said, you already kind of touched on that, like the seal is broken. But what do you say to people who are like, well, if we keep spinning this way, if conservatives decide to jump in and do the exact same thing liberals are doing, then it's all just going to spiral out of control? How do you approach that question?
I mean, one, I just don't think it's going to spiral out of control. Um, and this is just something about like how do hyperinflationary spirals happen? And most people have, that's sort of the threat underlying most of this stuff. Those only really happen when the economy actually collapses, right? Like, and that's usually war or Mugabe, something, either horrible, absolutely absurdly terrible governance possibility, or like seriously destructive war, because that means that usually hyperinflation is when you have a dramatic reduction in the production of goods and services, right? And as a result, all the money is just chasing like crazy, and you get hyperinflation. I doubt that even in a world where we just engage in all this really reckless spending, that we'd have just complete economic collapse. And so, the idea that we're the ones holding back the giant economy train from collapsing, I don't think that's true. I mean, that's not to say things won't get worse, that inflation won't continue, that we'll have stagflation, that it won't be rough. But I think if we're not willing to help our side, then the Democrats will continue to do pull stunts like this. Like
Right.
we know this, right? The game of, and they don't care what we do, right? This is another thing I always am so frustrated with conservatives. We're talking, this is going back to the wall debate and funding the wall via national emergency. Everyone was saying, but what about the precedent it will set if we do this? And I'm like, you have said that Democrats do unprecedented things all the time, right? Like, think about that. Democrats do unprecedented things all the time, which means they don't care what precedent you set. They will do what they're going to do. So the question is, are you willing to play the same game or not?
Yeah, that's the thing, is conservatives live in kind of this fantasy land where if you set the good example, then eventually everyone will understand the need for restraint and austerity, and they'll reward you for your careful, fiscal responsibility. But of course, that day never comes, right? Like
Right.
the next wave of free stuff is always going to be more exciting than your offers of careful, like penny counting. And during that time, the left is rewarding all of the people who are going to continue to vote for them, and you're just dwindling away as you kind of ensure, like we talked about, that like people don't engage in patterns of life that produce conservatism, conservative values, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of problem. I think also, like you said, at some point, even if we are at the raiding the treasury part of the end of the empire, like, well, then everyone, then it's all going to be gone anyway. Like, these people aren't going to stop. They have no restraint. So why are you pretending like your fiscal responsibility is going to like put a stopper in this?
Right. Yeah. There's a what we call in debate a uniqueness problem there, right? Like, so you're saying that the economy is so fragile that reckless spending will crash it. Okay, well, they're doing that already,
Right.
so we might as well get ours.
Yeah.
So that I don't think that's very compelling either way you look at it.
Yeah, I think you have a fundamental democracy problem there, just with the incentives that it lines up. If we might not be in charge tomorrow, so you might as well eat it all today, right? Is kind of what this system incentivizes, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so until something fundamentally changes with how we kind of operate the government, that's going to continue to be the case, and you can either play the game or you can lose. But there isn't another option. So one thing you talked about was the possibility of replacing this infrastructure, and I think that's really key because, again,
Mm-hmm.
I saw a lot of conservatives, some with the be responsible and pay back your stuff, some with the it's a left wing patronage thing, but and we have to figure it out. But very few people are explaining how you break the back of this thing, and I think you have to break the back of this thing because, like I said, this is an institution that is at the very center of our economy and our culture and our social hierarchy, and it is designed at every turn to churn out progressives and get you to go deeply into debt slavery to pay for the privilege of being indoctrinated. And there's just no way long term that conservatives can win this battle if this institution stays at the center. Like, it's not enough to just say don't send your kids or we need to end the page. Like, you fundamentally have to remove this system if you want to have a chance to win long term. And so I think that a lot of conservatives don't understand. Like, they just look at young kids and they're like, you're just spoiled, just work a summer job and pay off your college like I did when, when in the 1960s or 70s. And they just don't understand how much the system has warped around this whole thing, how much it's been subsidized, how much the cost has exploded. So I know this is a big ask. Obviously, this is like, hey, do you have the giant solution to the problem? But what would the escaping the system look like? What are some of the, even if just basic sketch outline, like what would be some of the steps that would look like where we can actually see the right, or people in general create a system that helps us to walk away from these institutions being the center of our culture?
So you need two things, right? You need to get rid of the existing credential, right? The credentialing system. You need to make that credential meaningless, or essentially mustless, worthless. And so that's where my first idea of you're not allowed to discriminate against employees on the basis of whether they have a bachelor's or not, like that. Maybe you keep professional schools, because, hey, med schools do teach people how to be doctors, and they actually are forced to really teach them well, because otherwise they go out of business. But the bachelor's degrees are worthless, and we're just not going to let employers talk about them anymore. I think that would be a stake in the heart of the most basic part of the credentialing system. But you do need to replace it, because there is a problem, right? I like to think it's like the Chesterton fence argument. You don't want to dismantle an institution until you understand what problem it's solving, right? The problem it solves very poorly, but the one is, basic employability competence. You need something to replace that. Well, we need to kind of create like certifications, which are acquired in various like actual disciplines that are tested, and it's not that necessarily you have to go to a school to get the certification. It's like a test you take, like the bar, or something else. And I think that's the most, if I'm just one guy, this is what I think. It's not like I have some giant policy platform or 100 pages explaining this, but that's the basic 1-2 punch, right? You want to knock out the credentials. The BA is an important credential, which means that I think university attendance would plummet, just absolutely plummet, in a world where you couldn't talk about what you're in a job interview that you have BA. And then you replace it with something that employers actually find more useful, right? Which would be, gosh, I can really test the subject matter knowledge of my potential employees.
Right.
Or if I know that if they got this certification, that they went to like a testing site, a blind testing site, and passed a test that demonstrates aptitude, that 1-2 punch would be really dramatic. And you can't just do that without some sort of government power being involved, right? You can't just like create that you can't compete with the existing university system. That doesn't work. You need to have government power, pushing, essentially like putting their thumb on the scale for the outcome you want to achieve.
One thing I think about is like tech certifications, right? Like if
Mhm.
you want to be in technical support, or you want to have certain jobs in tech, there's a whole mess of different certifications that are far more valuable than any necessary degree in a lot of those. And people who don't necessarily go to college can still stack up a sufficient number of these testing certifications and use that as qualifications. That's something that I think you could implement over a large number of disciplines. You could set up institutions that hand out those kind of certifications, and you could say, hey, well, these people are going to come out and they're going to they will actually have shown that they have the ability to operate this, rather than just the aptitude to like write poems about diversity for 4
Mhm.
years. So like they're far more valuable, and they're not like enslaved by student debt, and that could be a way kind of around that. Some of that's just kind of a beginning there.
Right. The light's getting a little bad here. Let me quickly.
Oh,
Hold
no
on.
problem.
Okay. Well,
Well,
that's about as good as it'll get. So,
no problem.
but yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We don't want to subsidize any more of this ridiculous indoctrination. We want people, but we want people with aptitude to actually do jobs. That is an important. Society does
Yeah.
fall apart if you don't have some sort of credentialing, certifying mechanism for young people so that they can enter the workforce. And it's not just a giant guessing game for employers.
Well, it's weird because we basically we banned like IQ tests, right?
Mhm.
But then we basically just abstracted IQ tests and we made them cost like $80,000.
Yeah,
That
yeah, that's
that's kind
absurd.
of,
We don't need to do
yeah,
that. We can go back to just that. That would be a really simple,
right,
dramatic policy change. Would be just at a federal level, be like IQ tests are acceptable. Go ahead,
yeah,
employers, go ahead and use them, but you can't ask about a BA.
yeah. Yeah.
We could even say
So
that BAs are racist, right? There's a structural problem with how expensive they are, so they're fundamentally racist. It's and since everybody knows that everybody has equal IQs, then therefore, like it's not racist to use those tests.
yeah, I would avoid that one just because I don't think the Dims are the real racists ever works ever. But
Right.
I
Oh, I
understand your
agree.
point.
I don't want to do it
Yeah,
that way, but
yeah.
I
But
one of the thing I do believe is that you should always. I guess this is actually kind of like a base level part of my philosophy. Is it's a lot easier to just accept your opponent's absurdity and use it creatively than to try and defeat it. Um, and that's not
yeah.
always true. Like sometimes you do have to defeat the absurdity because it is just so it ruins all your other arguments. But sometimes absurdities are exploitable, and when you find an exploitable absurdity, use it.
I hear what you're saying. I kind of disagree. I think that you end up if you when you absorb the frame of your enemy, when you accept certain parts of the frame of your enemy, you always think the reductio ad absurdum is going to kind of like be the one up, but it really just ends up kind of reinforcing the kind of the
Sure.
social norms of people. So that's one that I think it sounds clever and it feels like you're winning when you do that, and it wins with your side, but I don't think it ever really moves the needle. But point of disagreement there rhetorically.
Sure.
We're stacking up some super chats here. Is there anything that you wanted to address with the college system, season downs, anything that we didn't get to before we kind of look at what the people are asking?
No, let's listen to the people.
All right, here we go. So let's see. Watario Vids for $10. Thank you very much, sir. The Normicon response to all of this is let all the engineers of this problem off the hook to own the libs. Has been the most infuriating thing I had to watch in a while. Yeah, you see, I understand what you're saying. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to get around this, and in many ways, they're ignoring the problem of the people who actually caused it, right? Like all the damage has to fall on the students. They're the ones who have to suck it up, whatever. We don't need to actually worry about the people who generated this problem. I think unfortunately, like both Will and I hit pretty often that talk, that's a far too common response by a lot of conservatives.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, we've got Heath here for $5. He says student debt forgiveness is a humiliation ritual on the working and middle class. And see, this is the part, rather than the Dems or the real racists, I think this is the part that the Republicans should hit on a regular basis.
Yes.
Is that that you are fundamentally forcing working and middle class people to fund upper class, upper middle class and upper class people, their education, their way of life.
Right. That's absolutely like a part of the messaging here. It's not that every part of the Republican messaging has been off, but sort of like personal responsibility, rah rah, pull yourself by your bootstraps. That stuff's nonsense. But the
Mhm.
fact that this is a deeply, deeply classist policy, and we should, yes, be yelling and screaming about that while talking about what are we going to do to essentially get the scale back in order. And that means, something like we give money to married families with children who didn't partake of this particular policy.
Yeah, some money to people with trade certifications or people who are interested. Just finding those ways that will incentivize and will reward people who are going to be looking for your kind of society, your kind of politics, and building that kind of community moving forward here. Heath again for $5. Thank you very much. The GOP doesn't get it when the only time they've tried using patronage was the platinum plan. What do you think about the GOP attempts at patronage? Obviously, we talked about doing it with education. Are there other ways that the GOP can more smartly incentivize, people to vote for them, be involved in programs that they like, build kind of the families that will support and grow things? What are good
Yeah.
plans for the
Yeah,
GOP when it comes to
write
patronage?
laws that give additional rights or value to your voters. I think one of this is to analogize. I think if you actually passed a big tech law that said Americans have a right to their social media accounts, and if you took them away, they could go to court and sue to have them reinstated. That would be that's a form of patronage, right? Essentially, it's taking a right from these big tech companies and giving it to primarily your base, because those big tech companies aren't really banning the other side; they're banning your people.
Hmm.
So I think that would be one example of not even financial patronage really, but just another, figure out how are your constituents and voters being wronged, and how is it possible to write a new law to remedy that wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is one thing that I like about DeSantis. He seems to understand that he has the right attitude on that, and it's good to see someone actually exercising that. I'm one of the people who thinks that he should probably wait. He should let Trump. The storyline kind of has to complete, especially after the FBI raid and everything. Give Trump that last run. But I really like what DeSantis is doing, and I do think he's got a bright future, and because he understands this principle better than most. So Raging Mandrill here for $5. When will conservatives get rid of affirmative action? I might be wrong, but was there affirmative action case that the Supreme Court was talking about that?
Yeah, they're taking it up.
Sorry,
again.
I'll let you. Yeah, go ahead.
Taking it up.
You know what you're talking about. You go ahead.
That could. I mean, what happened? What just happened with abortion, right? I expect we'll see a 5-4 that just overthrows the existing. Basically says, guess what, colleges? Like, sorry, public universities, you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race at all. Period. Right? Yeah. No more of this. It's unlawful. I think that's coming.
Do you think that would be applied to the wider employment, situation?
I don't know.
And government programs?
Like, that'd be an interesting question. I think the way this law works is it doesn't apply to private universities, right? It's always the University of Texas at Austin or other public universities that are being challenged. Although, I don't know, maybe Harvard was too. I'm not sure. I think, but whatever it is, I think that there's a really, if you'd be crazy if you bet against a very conservative Supreme Court tossing out the past 25 years of affirmative action jurisprudence, because it's always only survived by like a thread. It's always survived on these weak 5-4s, and all of a sudden we have a real durable conservative majority in the Supreme Court. I think this year, honestly.
Yeah, any other time, I would have totally said you're crazy. This will never happen. But then I never thought I'd see Roe overturned in my lifetime. So I'm not gonna place any bets the other direction, even though my instinct is I don't think that would happen. After what happened with Roe, I wouldn't bet on that because who knows. So Currency Enjoyer for $2. Excellent name, thank you. Is it now or later ideal for purchasing a home? Yeah, I mean, a little off topic, but a good question. That's hard right now in the market because you have this scenario where I thought the market was gonna crash at some point here recently, and then it's just continued to climb. Obviously, it's slowing down now because of the shifts with the rates and the availability of loans and that kind of thing, and so we might finally see a correction here. But I don't know. Will, do you have any opinion on home purchasing?
Buy it when you're going to live in it for 10 years.
Yeah,
there's tax benefits and there's real good reasons. But speaking as a person who bought a home and then sold it a year later, and took a pretty big bath on that, I would say that the way to make money on real estate is not to time the market necessarily, but to buy and hold.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also like to, like there's also just something about, especially if you have a family, that kind of thing of what a home does for your family, just having the yard, having the stability, having, a place where you're not going to have to worry about your rent and you're not going to have to run out and find a new place next year. And your kids aren't going to have to go to different schools and find new friends and that kind of thing. There's a whole non-monetary aspect. So just make sure when you're buying your actual home, that's a decision that you're making for the good of like your family or your life, and less a decision you're making to like just make a certain amount of money, unless your goal is to like flip it. If you're just a young single person and you're moving through there. Yeah, there you go. We can see you now. You were becoming a mysterious villain there for a while.
I was relying on sort of ambient light, but the ambient light was going away.
All right, we've got Line Drinker here for $9.99. Thank you very much. Here's some beer money since I never catch any streams live. Congratulations on all your success. Thank you very much, man. Yeah, no, I know Line Drinker's been around since the very beginning of this channel, back when I had like nobody on here. So it's great to see him come by. I really appreciate that, man. Thank you so much. Let's see. Do we have any other questions here? I think we might have one more. Let me double check. I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Oh, we got one more here. Glad I double checked. Or two more here. Okay, hold on. Sorry here, Glow in the Dark. I'm hunting for your comment so I can actually put it on the screen. Well, let me grab the one I see, and then we'll go to that one here. Sean Wineland for $2. Tanks and Harvard yard win. An excellent question, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Turn the universities back into monasteries, right? The reverse Henry VIII.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
Henry VIII.
Make them something
useful.
Teach
something of value.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. This should be the end goal. It really is, like, until the university system is completely discredited, you're just not going to see victory. And so
Yeah.
until you totally see these places, and they're in the process now, they're destroying their own credibility in a lot of ways. Like, even Harvard has like degree mill programs at this point. So the idea that these places are like charities, they're operating for the good of society is absolutely insane. Like, they're just for profit companies. But they are in the process of discrediting themselves. But it's going to take a long time. The faster you can make that happen, the better.
Right.
Glow in the dark here for $5. Thank you, sir. Make it so you can declare bankruptcy on new college debt. The lenders and colleges would be less inclined to give out bad degrees. What do you think about bankruptcy for college debt?
I mean, it's a start, right?
Yeah.
Would be better than nothing, not enough to solve the problem.
Yeah, it's a necessary but not sufficient step there, right? Like, it should
Right.
absolutely happen, but it does not in and of itself keep people from investing in that system. And in the end of the day, you really do want to make that system uh, as dead as possible, as useless as possible. All right, guys. Well, we made it through the super chats here. Will, is there anything you want people to check out? Anything you got coming up? Anything you want to direct people towards?
May have an announcement on the job front pretty soon, but in the short term, follow me on Twitter at Will Chamberlain. That's where my contact goes right now.
Okay, guys, make sure that you check out Will there. Let me thank a few people who make this possible on Subscribestar real quick. I want to go ahead and thank Easter Worshipper. I want to thank Dursreg. I want to thank F1F00C09. I want to thank Santa. That's right, big man. He supports the channel. AWXYZ. Let's see, who else do we have here? Want to thank Jonathan Anomaly, and I want to thank uh, Leading Tone. Thank you guys so much for your help. Thank you to everyone who was super chatting today. If this is your first time on the channel, make sure that you subscribe. If you're unfamiliar, I've got a Substack that you might want to join. I'm going to be putting out the next chapter of the Total State here in the next week. So if you want to have that available, you want to be able to read the whole thing, make sure you subscribe over there. Also had a few different appearances here recently. I was on with Michael Malice. I was on with Steve Deese again. I was on with Buck Johnson. So if you want to check any of that stuff, you can also find the links for all that over on the Substack. So make sure that you grab that over there. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Will, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, guys. Have a good one. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.